Ooh. All right, thanks everybody. We'll get started here. My name is Eleni. I am an organizer with the Debt Collective, and I'm basically just here facilitating this really exciting session in part of the buildup of the Debt Collective's campaign for full student debt cancellation by or before May 1st. It's a very long march towards student debt cancellation, and it's never been this close before. It's a really exciting moment to be in the movement, and really cool to see sessions like this one of broadening the picture of who actually is at stake, who's impacted by student debt. Workers are obviously important, so really excited to be here. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ian Rhodewalt. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a member of GEO UAW 2322, or I should say I was until 2 weeks ago when I graduated from my program in a master's in labor studies at UMass Amherst. And I am really excited to be talking about why student debt is a labor issue. We had, as a sort of introductory exercise, we were planning to have a Padlet for people to write why they think student debt is a labor issue, but we were having some technical difficulties with that. So if you're able to, or if you have an idea on why student debt is a labor issue, just jot that down into the chat. Or if you'd like to maybe 5 or 6 people, if you want to just put write stack in the chat, and I'll try to call on a few people. And we'll do this for about 5 or 7 minutes. Seeing some really good responses.
These are powerful.
Yeah. Debt guarantees labor for capital, and it robs our time by making us work to pay it off, because debts are basically the wages of the future. Student debt leads to overwork and less of work-life balance. Student debt also helps prop up Wall Street.
This is awesome. Anybody else have other thoughts? Why should we think of student debt as anybody want to speak to the comment that they put in the chat?
Because the government's strength of control is through currency, flow restriction, inflation, and debts. In 2022, our economy has undergone so much change from where it was only 30 years ago. These days, working class people are taught we must go to college to make sure we can live an okay life. Our colleges systems is centered around profits, keeping us dependent on the 1% and in their pockets for decades after we leave. It forces many of us to stay in low-paid government with the hope of that public interest loan forgiveness. Ty, you're on stack.
Hey, thank you, Ian. So when I think about student debt, I think about how college education is a kind of like set price. Mostly, there's like a median price, right? But like the jobs that we get afterwards are not valued at the same level as our education. Like it doesn't signal the same thing to labor markets that it used to. I think someone else said, like, right, economy has changed in 30 years. Currently I'm teaching, and my students in undergrad are concerned because they don't think an undergrad's enough, and they already have too many loans as well.
That's a great point. If anyone else has any other thoughts, they can put them in the chat. Otherwise, I might go ahead with my prepared remarks. And there's one more here. Debt, I've come to learn, is the physical embodiment of trading my future for my own physical exploitation. It's
That's
very powerful.
powerful. So maybe, Ian, before you jump into your marks, I just want to say, like, this is a really cool, this is like a very important gathering that we have here because of precisely this conversation that's just happened in the chat, that debt is intimately tied to our labor, and our labor is intimately tied to our debt. And having an organizing approach that addresses these two things in the same moment is like absolutely essential towards advancing our struggle. So it's really exciting to be here to have this conversation and to get to learn from Ian, who has already sort of taken some really important steps in this direction. So maybe before Ian launches in, I'll just set up what we're going to do for the evening. Ian's going to talk about his work bringing bringing student debt as an issue for his labor union, and then the broader labor federation that his union is a part of to consider. And he's starting from a really important organizing question, which isn't, he's going to tell us about all the things that he won, but he's also going to start from a very important question, which is, where does one begin? How you can see where you want the story to end, but it's oftentimes very difficult to actually think of how to start. And so that's where the story that Ian's going to tell us tonight. Then we're going to take a little bit of time to sort of brainstorm and workshop together how we could take some of these lessons into our own work, into our unions or with our coworkers. And then I'm going to kind of give a little bit of an orientation of how this fits into the Debt Collective's April 4th Day of Action, and what some of the next steps are that we can think about. So feel free. It's I think both Ian, I hope Ian also agrees that this is a very friendly, open space, and questions are a sign of respect and engagement. So speak up when you have thoughts and questions. And it is, for folks that are new to the call, great to have you here. Feel free to throw your introduction, name, city, sector of work, union, if you're lucky enough to have one, in the chat, and it's being recorded. I'll send the recording out after the session tonight. So take it away, Ian.
Great. Thanks, Delaney, for that framework and introduction. So the title of this is Why Student Debt Cancellation is a Labor Issue. And I want to start with two quotes first that are not necessarily from labor activists, but are important in framing this. The first is a Bayard Rustin quote: "Let us be enraged about injustice, but let us not be destroyed by it." And the second is a Bell Hooks quote: "Education was about the practice of freedom." So I've divided my remarks into a sort of brief formal introduction and then a more informal description of the timeline of, I guess, this past month or 5 weeks that I've been working on the resolution that our area labor federation has passed. Student debt cancellation is a racial justice issue, an economic justice issue, and a gender equity issue. It's also an opportunity for intergenerational coalition building, as 1 in 5 people responsible for paying off student debt is over the age of 50. For these reasons and more, unions and labor federations and labor councils across the country are beginning to call for all student debt to be canceled. We know that student debt is a punitive tool of social control. I'm going to pause there and repeat that for a second. We know that student debt is a punitive tool of social control. The Debt Collective has really done a superb job in illuminating how student debt is not a personal fault or character flaw, as it has been portrayed in mainstream political discourse for a long time, but rather an intentional policy choice that systematically targets and effectively punishes poor, working class students, particularly students of color, for seeking to pursue any level of education or training beyond a high school diploma. It is a lie that serves the interests of maintaining the status quo that student debt cancellation would primarily benefit wealthy or elite students of Ivy League colleges. Student debt affects people who go to vocational school, technical school, beautician school, 2-year associate degree programs, 4-year bachelor degree programs, and graduate school, whether that's at community school, state universities, private colleges, or for-profit schools. Additionally, student debt affects people who began some form of education beyond high school, but for whatever reason, whether that's health, family issues, needing to find more work, did not complete their programs. While student debt affects us all and affects our communities and economies locally, regionally, and nationally, it does not affect us all in the same way. Black students carry $25,000 more in student debt on average than their white peers. Women hold 2/3 of student debt, and Black women in particular hold 20% more than white women. Eliminating $50,000 of student debt would close the racial wealth gap by 40%. What we are advocating, though, both in the Debt Collective and in the resolution that we've passed at the Western Massachusetts Area Labor Federation, is for Biden to cancel all student debt by executive order, which would work towards closing the racial wealth gap even more. I think it's important to keep in mind at this point in discussing the ramifications of canceling student debt through a racial justice lens, the racial demographics of the labor movement and of unionized workers. Black workers are the most likely to be unionized at a rate of 11.5%, according to 2021 Bureau of Labor Statistics, compared to 10.3% for white workers, 7.7% for Asian workers, and 9.0% for Hispanic workers. And that's using the BLS's nomenclature for race and ethnicity. I wanted to share those statistics as we keep in mind who is most adversely impacted by student debt, and also who makes up union workers. The student debt crisis is a manufactured crisis that began with the actions of one of the biggest union busters in the past century, Ronald Reagan. When Reagan was governor of California, he pushed the University of California system to charge students tuition in an effort to tamp down on on-campus protests. As a senator, Joe Biden continued this work as he represented Delaware, the credit card capital of the world, and worked to expand student lending and fought for legislation that weakened borrower protections. So while Biden may position himself now as the most union-friendly president, we need to take into account and keep in mind his long history as the champion of credit card companies. It's a question of, is he Scranton Joe or Wilmington Biden? If he is the most union-friendly president, then he needs to know that unions have demands of him. And what we are stating clearly here is that our unions demand that he cancel student debt, all of it. If we in our unions are negotiating contracts for better wages for our members, one question to ask ourselves is what ultimately is the purpose of winning these better wages if substantial chunks of that money just has to be poured into the bottomless void that is student debt? So whether or not your union pursues a bargaining for the common good model or bargains more over strictly bread and butter issues around wages and benefits, student debt is an issue that affects unions and union members. Additionally, student debt cancellation is a labor issue because of younger workers, younger millennials and Generation Z, who have less experience being represented by unions, see unions and labor councils and labor federations coming out strongly on this issue. It will undoubtedly lead to more continued interest in joining or starting unions among younger workers. During this particular moment in which we are witnessing Starbucks workers organizing, Amazon workers organizing, REI retail workers organizing, graduate student employees organizing, and more new union organizing drives. The age group with the highest union density is the 45 to 54-year-old group. If we in the labor movement want to gain more membership amongst younger workers, fighting to cancel student debt is a very strategic action that we could take. Finally, research estimates that canceling student debt would boost the economy by $108 billion and create 1 million jobs. What's to prevent those jobs from being good union jobs? And I'll shift now to sort of more informal sort of presentation of the timeline of developing the resolution that we passed at Western Massachusetts Area Labor Federation. So for me, becoming aware of the debt collective began last January, I think it was, when I heard an interview with Astra Taylor and Braxton Brewington on Democracy Now! And then at the end of this past December, I heard another interview with Astra on the Bad Faith podcast and began following the debt collective more closely. And then at the beginning of this new year in January, I became a member of the debt collective. I've been a member of the Western Massachusetts Area Labor Federation since September of 2020 as a delegate from my union, and was familiar with some of the resolutions that we had previously passed. In January, I had started to write daily postcards to my representative, senators, state representative, and state senator. So I started to compile the statements and reasons for debt cancellation into a document that became the resolution. Together with another delegate to Western Mass Area Labor Federation, who's from SEIU, Jerry Levinsky, and our executive director, Lydia Wood, I worked on editing the resolution. And I also want to thank Liam Good, who's the Massachusetts chapter of the Debt Collective contact, for introducing me to the particular language of compromise and settlement powers of the Department of Education, which is the authority that grants the president to cancel student debt, and which I had previously not known anything about. We introduced this resolution at our January 10th meeting, where our delegates unanimously and enthusiastically endorsed it. And there was a lot of discussion there from folks from teachers unions, nurses unions, trades unions, graduate employee unions. The next day, we sent out press releases to about 30 news media outlets that we had on our compiled press contact list. And at my first response was, I'd sent all these emails out and wasn't getting any email back immediately. And so I was like, oh, nobody wants to hear my story. It's the mainstream media trying to silence me. But then pretty quickly, a local news website here in town picked it up. And then I was contacted by a journalist from New England Public Radio requesting a radio interview, and that came out on MLK Day. At this point, Liam connected me with Braxton, the Debt Collective's press secretary, who helped to amplify on social media some of the publicity that we were getting. And this was an exciting moment for me personally, because as I just mentioned, it was Braxton and Astra's interview on Democracy Now! That first got me clued into the work that Debt Collective does. We then got coverage from Channel 22, WWLP News in Springfield, a regional TV news station. And around that time, Business Insider picked up the story after the New England Public Radio piece came out. And that's when Troy Area Labor Federation in Troy, New York passed a similar resolution. And I'll mention a little bit more about theirs later. At some point in this, I think, third week after we passed our resolution, Senator Elizabeth Warren learned about our resolution, either, hopefully from the postcards that I had sent her office or from the NEPR interview, because she referenced it in an interview with Teen Vogue. And I just want to say that Teen Vogue has been doing some of the best labor reporting out there. They really excel in that area. My one quibble with Elizabeth Warren's interview there is that she referred to Western Massachusetts Area Labor Federation as one of the unions, as opposed to a federation of more than 60 public and private sector unions. So I called her office to correct her minor mistake, and also reached out to contact the journalist, and they put an editor's note in the article. After the news started picking up and momentum was growing on the story, Lydia, our executive director, connected with a city councilor in Northampton, and we worked together on adapting a draft for city council. They've introduced that at a meeting on February 3rd, where it was very positively received. fairly unanimously, and they'll be voting on it at another meeting that's actually happening right now. And Rachel is confident that the city councilor is confident that it will pass. I reached out to two of my town councilors here in the town of Amherst, and we've been working on a draft of a resolution for Amherst, which we'll be presenting at a meeting in early March. My local UAW 2322, we first passed it in our abolition committee, and then I brought it to the joint council meeting. And given the geographical range of our local, we have shops in Vermont and Southern New Hampshire. We brought in the elected officials that the resolution called upon to pressure the White House to include Vermont and New Hampshire governors, senators, and representatives. And also back to the point about Troy Area Labor Council's resolution, it calls on New York Governor Kathy Hochul and Senators Chuck Schumer and Kristen Gillibrand to demand that Biden sign this executive order to cancel student debt. We've been having conversations with other labor councils and labor federations regionally, as well as across the country. Some have been more productive than others. What's interesting is that our labor federation is somewhat unique in that resolutions can be introduced by rank and file delegates and don't have to have like the backing of a whole union behind it. And so that's what happened with this resolution. And so I think maybe some of the reasons why we're not having as much feedback from some of the labor councils I've reached out to is that it's not coming from a union within their labor council. We're hoping to get it on the agenda for the spring meeting of the Massachusetts State AFL-CIO. And we're connecting with the greater Springfield area NAACP to build coalition on this issue. And we're also connecting with Senator Bernie Sanders' office. So that's a sort of brief rundown of the timeline. And in a moment, I'll take some questions, but I also just wanted to throw some ideas or questions out for how folks here on the call might bring this back to your union or labor council. You might brainstorm your circles of influence that you have within your union, any connections that you might have with change makers and movers and shakers there. Are you a steward? Do you have a steward? Do you know your steward? Could you or your steward introduce this at a stewards assembly? Are you involved with the bargaining committee or organizing committee of your union? Or do you know people who are? Do you know your union's co-chairs or president or vice president? Could you bring a resolution on student debt before a general membership meeting for a vote to endorse it? Do you know what that process entails? And other than that, I'll be happy to take questions at this point.
Wow, that's a great story. So many interesting observations and twists and turns. If you have a question, go ahead. We'll use the stack to take questions. So if you have a question, just type stack in the chat and I'll keep track of the speakers list from there. Go ahead, Holly.
Thank you. I'm wondering what's a good resource to start to learn how to put together a resolution on student debt to endorse it?
So much of sorry, my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Much of the information that I got from the Debt Collective's website. Eleni has just put our resolution that I wrote, a link to it here in the chat, and you can feel free to download and adapt that I guess I just point to the Debt Collective as a real hub of resources. And also in terms of the ins and outs of like resolution language, I sort of learned that on the fly from looking at other resolutions my federation had passed. But it's mostly whereas, and then therefore now be it resolved X, Y, or Z, where the X, Y, or Z being we call upon President Biden to pass an executive order to cancel all student debt.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then Eleni has also put in, so we have our resolution, but then also a template that doesn't have our specific like state and statistics and state congressional delegation. So you can feel free to use that as well as a resource.
I'm going to put myself, oh, go ahead, Andrew, stack.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian, for the presentation and for all your work. I had a question for you about your outreach efforts, and anyone else for that matter. But first of all, just wanted to underline that the Debt Collective is itself a union, and a completely unique union, really the first effort to form a debtors union that we know of. And, you know, we can talk about that a little later, but my question for you is whether you've come across a response along the lines of, well, this is an issue that it should be germane to education unions, but it's not for all unions. And it seems to me there is a kind of a perception out there that it's a no-brainer for especially higher education or teachers unions. But when it comes to the auto workers union or whatever, it's not their bailiwick, which is an obstacle we're trying to overcome, because which union would not, I mean, which union members would not want their kids to go to a tuition-free college and have a debt-free education? I mean, that should be a no-brainer. But there's a barrier there, I think, on the union landscape. And I just wondered if you'd come across that kind of response.
That's a great question. We haven't had that explicitly stated to us. I mean, there has been, like, in some cases, a lack of response from in outreach, which may sort of illustrate some of that hesitancy. But in the January meeting where we introduced the resolution, there some folks were suggesting that it could be definitely an issue that our education committee could take up in terms of, and that's for educating our members on this specific issue. Not just as an education committee that serves educator unions. But I mean, you mentioned the auto workers union. The United Auto Workers is my union, and we at the international level we have more and more graduate workers.
Right. Right.
So it's a very valid point, and I think we just have to keep sort of illustrating the fact that it's sort of all interconnected and all interlinked, and an injury to one is an injury to all, which is sort of a guiding theme. And I think it comes out of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, but in the labor movement, and should be sort of thought of more broadly as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It's very helpful. And I mentioned the UAW in particular because, because they do have, these graduate student locals and graduate employee locals. And yet the message doesn't seem to have, to have gone all the way up to the international. And it's it's a source of puzzlement why it's so difficult for them to get their heads around this at this point.
Yeah.
But that's part of the work we're trying to do here. So
Yeah.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody have other questions for Ian? I want to just draw out something that I heard in Ian's journey towards passing this resolution, is that it started with a very simple step, which was listening to other people talk. In this case, it was listening to Asher and Braxton. And then it was Ian going and talking to people in his union and also writing letters to his representatives. And I think that's a really, really important step towards that. It's just like, that sort of simple step of being part of conversations with people is how all organizing kind of comes to life. So I think just thinking about that, I guess I want to open up the kind of shift the discussion. If folks have ideas or questions about how, or want to sort of brainstorm, we're going to take a few minutes to kind of collectively workshop and think through how you might go about in your local or union, how you might go about doing something like this. Where could you get started, or what would you anticipate to be obstacles or potential first steps? Just have some space to kind of brain trust those questions.
And Emily put a good point here in the chat. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that at all?
Yeah, so I was the former president of UAW 2865 out in California. And I mean, this was back in 2018 when I brought this out to what was then Region 5 and to get support. I mean, there was a College for All ballot initiative, which ultimately didn't make it on the ballot. But I mean, I did speak with Ian at these regional conferences about getting support for both debt relief as well as prospectively with having freed state colleges in California. And there was a fair amount of support. So at the sort of regional level, which is also going to be drawn at a national level, the significant majority of members are not in higher ed or or technical workers. I mean, even though grad workers actually make up a significant portion of UAW, it's nowhere close to the majority. And so, but with a lot of sort of auto workers, people weren't opposed to it. So it's not like people were oh, we shouldn't do this. It was just a relatively low priority when they're thinking about either sort of on a legislative level. And so, but people did like the idea of it. And so, in terms of building solidarity, I think that it's more of a matter of having bringing this, depending on sort of with your union, bring this to the international with a strong support, to say, we want this. Because most people aren't going, most unions are not going to reject this on adding it on their agenda as one of their asks. It's really a matter of how strongly are they going to support it? Is this just going to be on a letter on letterhead, or are they going to actually invest some of their institutional resources? And I think there can be a case for the latter, and there just has to be a very strong and strategic ask.
Yeah, and to that point, that was one of the questions that I was asked when I introduced it at our locals joint council, is that after we voted to pass it, it was the what next step, and I think that's something that I've been trying to sort of answer by doing, in terms of like passing this resolution and then reaching out to other community actors and like the town council and city council and the connection that unions have with politicians, I think is an important one, or that there's a perceived pressure point that in some places is more effective than others. I mean, there's some politicians that don't listen to unions at all, but you know, the Democratic Party says that they're the party of the unions, and if we can influence at sort of the local and town and municipal level, maybe Democratic politicians to pass resolutions like this, then that continues to sort of build momentum on the message and amplify the sound waves around it, if you will.
Jason, you want to jump in with your short stack question?
Yeah, it was actually related to this. So I'll word it slightly differently and ask, how do you leverage resolutions into power? Because to give another example, I think now Debt Collective has helped get close to 30 municipal resolutions passed across the country. But how do we leverage that into power? Like how do we move from the page to some sort of movement that people are gonna take notice of? So I don't expect you to have like the right answer to this question, but I think it's something that if we could think it together about, like, what do we do when we get a bunch of resolutions together afterwards, I think would be really, really helpful.
I don't have an immediate answer to that. I think it's a great question. And it is something that I've wondered in the past is what sort of teeth do resolutions have, and how effective can they be if there's not, well, you know, workers, our strongest power is to be able to withhold our labor. I was a public sector employee at UMass, and so legally and in our contract, we're prevented from striking. But a strike is only deemed legal or illegal by its effectiveness. So that's my personal take on that, and is maybe slightly different from the question of teeth to a resolution. But I'm hearing what you're saying and sort of trying to open that up to further discussion.
Okay, we have a direct response, Emily, direct response, and then Jackie on stack.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's all about like alignments with tactics and targets. So, I mean, if you're thinking about in the context of a municipal resolution, I mean, the idea of that is it signals like a significant amount of support that you're hopefully getting your congressional representative to sign onto, and they're much more likely to sign on it if, like, I mean, if they have like a dozen or half a dozen or even a handful of municipalities in their district that have agreed to these resolutions, have passed a resolution.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jackie?
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. Sure can.
Also, just very quickly, I'm the teen Vogue writer that you just mentioned. So very cool to see my worlds coming together. But this is kind of a small thing, and forgive me if it's already been done before, but I'm wondering if there are union folks who, like rank and file folks, who'd be willing to write like op-eds or something like that. Just because I think in the published version, it might be an easy and useful thing to point other unions and other workers to, as opposed to like, and I think that's also something that, like, if we were able to get multiple op-eds published, or even just one that's something where you can mention, right? Like we have resolutions from X number of unions already who've come on board XYZ. And then that's also then something that people can turn around and use to organize more rank and file folks. But I think the other part of that too is it sort of begins to poke a hole at that narrative that you guys have been talking about, that like working class people are somehow separate from people who have degrees, right? And sort of bridge those fights together and kind of communicate the idea that we're all people who are working towards this. But I don't know how complicated it would be, or in terms of timing, because I know we're working towards April 4th to get rank and file members who'd be comfortable publishing op-eds or writing op-eds.
Jackie, that's a great suggestion. I'm sorry, were you finished?
Yep, sorry.
Oh, no. And I just want to flag that tomorrow evening, the Debt Collective is hosting an op-ed writing workshop session. It's going to be a 2-part series. You're free. It's Friday from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And it's also the following Friday. So if what Jackie just said kind of caught your ear, but you don't quite know how to get started, or if you get started, you don't know how to go from writing your thoughts to getting published, you should definitely come to this workshop. It's with an expert publicist who's pretty ready to help folks get their pieces placed. So that's a great little promo I can send out. I think it's been in the Debt Collective email. So if you're not signed up for the email, you should be, but otherwise I can include that in the resolution, the email to follow. Thank you for that, Nick, appreciate it. Okay, there was someone on Stack, and I do want to make sure that we get to this, keep drilling onto this question of and then how do we use these resolutions to keep building power? Because I think that's exactly the question.
And I just was going to add to what you were saying about to Jackie's question. One thing that we're planning to do is hold sort of either weekly or maybe bi-monthly letter writing sessions, and that's writing letters to the not to the editor, but to congressional delegates. But that could easily also be letters to the editor in that session. So thank you for putting that into the mix.
Awesome. Okay, PG on Stack.
Okay, yes, on this question of building power, we need to think about building power toward what? And the question at hand right now is executive action by President Biden. So what does President Biden need? President Biden needs political capital. And we can look to how the COVID recovery plan was played out for him. There was a very compelling little video a couple of months ago put out by the Democratic Party, lauding the great success of President Biden in bringing us through the shortest recession in US history, and the great successes that came with how he treated the COVID recovery plan. That's what he's about as the leader of the Democratic Party at this moment. So what do we have to offer with these resolutions? I think that if they are coherently amplifying and delivering political credit for him giving us that executive order to cancel all student debt, that's, I think, our strongest card, the strongest card on our deck right now with regard to that particular goal. Among the things that he has signaled are important to him are that he is a pro-labor president. We have seen that. Those of us in DSA especially have seen that with the PRO Act campaign, hooking into the administration and putting pressure on, for example, our Senator Mark Warner here in Virginia, to the credit of President Biden. So linking, canceling all student debt to President Biden being a pro-labor president and delivering things for labor. He's also been at loggerheads with Joe Manchin, our neighbor here in West Virginia, who has sapped the second part of COVID recovery, has sapped Build Back Better by subverting its budget. This is a way for President Biden to get around that and put the go big back into Build Back Better. And so I think that working on that rhetoric consistently and carefully, even if it's not exactly what President Biden has in his heart, but making that a big political prize that will be acknowledged once the cancellation of all student debt is delivered. I think that's our strongest card rhetorically. Biggest pernicious threat to that is the rebranding, the relabeling of cancel to cancel some. That was the worst thing that happened to this fight when Elizabeth Warren redefined cancel to be cancel some. So rhetoric about only 10,000 or 50,000 or at least 50,000, anything that mentions a number or talking about interest rates, that saps the power, that saps the argument.
All right, I think that's a good transition maybe to start thinking about what the point, PJ, that you just made about what is our leverage over Biden and how do we exert pressure on him in a way that can actually, he's the guy that can that's going to move on this issue. It's not going to win through Congress. And this is why the debt collective is moving very quickly to get ready for a mass day of action on April 4th in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to make the case that resolutions are could be part of this strategy towards building pressure for April 4th. Resolutions on their own, we all know, aren't going to call for the canceling the debt, but it's a way for people to stake a flag in the ground in their communities to say, I believe in this. Do you believe in this with me? And that's kind of how we can keep building the pressure. So I just want to announce kind of a few ideas and steps ahead for thinking about as you're moving forward with this and hearing Ian's story, how you can take this into your own fights, whether it's through a resolution or potentially using a resolution as a way to encourage your union to organize a bus to come to Washington, D.C. Perhaps to organize your union to have a debtors assembly or do a debt audit of all the debt that's held in the district, or the I guess not all of us work in districts, but the entity. Or perhaps a third option is to do a kind of local direct action at your workplace. We're going to have on April 4th, we're inviting all workers to participate in a Take Your Debt to Work Day, in which we all wear our amount. This is sort of styled after the Red for Ed movement, but we all wear our debt amount on a piece of paper or a piece of tape to our shirt, take pictures and put it on the internet. I just want to sort of throw these out as some suggestions and to think about what are basically like, once the resolution is a way to kind of begin the conversation, it's not the ending point of the conversation. And once a resolution is in place, and it also doesn't need to be the first step. If you think you could do other things, really, we're trying I think what is going to tip the scales on this at some point is getting more people more active. So the more kind of in the streets we can get is going to be really helpful. I put a bunch of links in the chat, which I'll follow up on, but Ian had mentioned, or some people ask questions of like, how do I go about making a resolution? This is an info sheet that gives a rundown about the April 4th day of action and what it's going to look like and where it's going to be and how you can come either get to DC, or if it's impossible for you to get to DC, what are options for you for having actions in your area? So having a take your debt to work day, or having a local debtors assembly. And then there's two final points that I want to make, is that we're going to be having another strategy call on Tuesday, February 22nd. That's next Tuesday, that we're going to kind of begin to get into the down. And if you're interested in one of these ideas of like, yeah, I really think I could get my folks in my union are really into this idea. I think I could get 10 of us on a bus. If there was a bus, I live in Pittsburgh. I think there could be a bus. We could get 10 people on a bus. Come to this meeting. This is exactly where we're going to help you figure out how to make these nuts and bolts, or like what Jason is saying. If you think that people would be ready to move on having a debtors assembly, come to this meeting and we can get plugged in of how to take this next step towards action. So that's February 22nd. It's a game planning meeting. This is like, we're sort of moving out of the strategy and into the logistics terrain. And that's when when the fight really starts to get serious, is when you've figured out the strategy. We know what it needs to take to win. Biden needs to, we have the language, we have the strategy. Now we need just to figure out the logistics for the play. So I invite everybody to this call. And then I guess just to kind of close, there's been a lot said here and we just have a few minutes, but I'd just like to ask everybody to take a few minutes to just fill out a form, this Google form, to let me commit to what the next step is that you're going to take to bring this, to keep pushing this ball. We're at a point right now where we've never been closer to student debt cancellation, and that means that every single move matters. Every single move that we're all making matters and we're gaining action. So invite folks to fill out this form. Let us know what you might be interested in. And then folks at the Debt Collective will be in touch. We'll reach out and figure out how to get you plugged into to the next steps. So that's a lot of links. I promise I will send an email to follow up, but also wanted to see if there's any questions, or Ian, if you have final thoughts to close us off with.
Well, I was just going to say, what you mentioned about how the resolutions can be conversation starters. I think the Debt Collective has really opened the conversation on the issue of debt, and making it not an issue of either shame or taboo to discuss. And I think one other thing that is sort of tied in with this question that's in the chat about, are there any discussions that anyone has been part of in their own unions about whereby people are willing to withhold any political endorsements unless a candidate supports a resolution on this? I'm unfamiliar with that, but I know that for us in the Western Mass Area Labor Federation, we do have a municipal candidate or a municipal politician elected official breakfast with the Federation coming up in early March, where a number of them are union not sponsored, union supported, union endorsed candidates who won election this past November. And now this breakfast is a part of sort of maintaining pressure on them on what our what's the word? I'm blanking now. What our priorities are, and so bringing these resolutions to events like that, and maintaining the level of communication with these elected officials at the local level, then hopefully trickles up. And other than that, I just want to thank everyone here for coming out tonight.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Ian, for all of your work and for teaching us about making such a great path, charting a path. It's good to hear about it. Yes, we do have a sample resolution. Ian, I'll shoot it in an email, but let's see, if you can hang on a second, I can send it to you now. This is Ian's, and there's a Google Doc that has a sort of a template, a generic template too. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. It's really wonderful to gather with you all. Solidarity. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's a great session. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for all that excellent facilitation, Eleni.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah.
You're amazing. I just was like the little guy with the curling stick.
I will try to be on the next call about op-eds.
Awesome.
And I will otherwise see